Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by Get Around Caboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Road Rules 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project, and let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm here in the studio with Robert Martin, who is all the way over in Copenhagen, but comes from closer to home, which is very exciting. So it's really nice to get this across the globe perspective. I'm here on Gubbi Gubbi country in Queensland in Caboolture, just on the northern outskirts of Brisbane. Robert, you're calling from Copenhagen. Are you living in the central area or on the outskirts?
Yeah, hi Wendy. Thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan. I'm smack bang in the middle of Copenhagen. I don't think you could get much more central than where I am. It's a little neighborhood called Vesterbro, which means Western Bridge, even though it's located in the south. And it's just right next to the main central train station.
I know you because on a professional social media account, you made some posts and I made some posts, and I think we've been going back and forth a little bit. I was quite interested in the fact that you were in Copenhagen, which was very cool because it's very nice to have an Australian perspective in Copenhagen. And also you have something called the mobility diet, which I became really curious about. So perhaps you could speak about how you arrived where you are. Where did you grow up in Sydney? What was that like? What's that transition been like?
So I grew up in a mix between outer Western Sydney and the Blue Mountains. I split my time between the two. I would predominantly now say that I'm from the Blue Mountains, and that's where I tend to spend the most of my time when I'm back in Australia. I think it was a bit of a funny story to actually get where I am now. When I was 18, I was incredibly bored of Blue Mountains and was so eager to get to the city. So I moved down, I went to university, I studied architecture. Through studying architecture, it somehow led me to Copenhagen. I think Copenhagen and Denmark is very well known for architecture. We have the Sydney Opera House, which was designed by a Dane. What was supposed to be a 6-week project in Copenhagen has now been a 12-year stay over here, which has briefly been interrupted by living in Saudi Arabia. I was living in the capital Riyadh for some time, and also the northeastern part of the United States.
Well, you have a few different places there and very different. So I've lived in Sweden, France, England, Sydney and Caboolture. You've done a much broader view. So describe Riyadh a little bit.
To describe it very, very simply, it's a city in the middle of the desert. It's like if you were to just force a city in the middle of Australia. And it can be done because it just has unlimited resources through the oil that they have there. It is literally a city that doesn't necessarily have anything for itself. Everything is shipped in from around the world, which is quite crazy. You can go to the supermarket and buy salmon or lamb from 10 different countries. This was also 10 years ago I was living there. But as a city, I think it's changed a little bit. It's a very car-dependent place. I think when your natural resource is oil, you tend to build a transportation system that runs around the car. And it was crazy. Gas was cheaper than water. I think you could fill up a Camry for about $8 Australian, which is just absolutely insane. But it also means that then you have a very private life there. Everything happens behind closed doors. There's not a lot of, let's say, people out in the street. There's no urban life because the way that the system is set up is people basically drive from one air-conditioned space to another.
Oh, that's very interesting because I always think about those areas as having really amazing markets, but you're saying no, there wasn't. It was much more hermetically sealed space.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a huge influence of the US, especially in Riyadh, and I think that might have to do with the way that it was developed and the countries that helped it develop once it found oil. But I think it's really interesting actually because I've now been fortunate enough to live in 4 different countries, and I think in my own work I can very much see how different cities influence the way we move in them. This is how I naturally got into working with mobility as an architect. Maybe that's not such a normal segue for most people. But essentially, what I realized over time is the way that we design our cities influence the transportation choices that we have. To give you a very basic example, when I was living in the Blue Mountains, although there is a train line, we're fortunate, it isn't, say, the most convenient way to get around, especially when people aren't living close to the station. So I think when I was 17, I was very fortunate to get an old secondhand car and I would drive around. But then when I moved to Sydney to study at university, I think I only had the car for less than 12 months. because I was so frustrated by congestion. I could never find a place to park. I ended up just buying a bike because it was much easier to get around for short trips. It's not until later on in my professional career that I've actually connected, okay, it's actually the way that the city was designed is actually allowed me to move in a separate way rather than it me having some anti-car stance or making some political decision about it. I simply just wanted to do what was easiest.
Whereabouts were you in the US?
Connecticut, just in New Haven.
What was that like compared to Western Sydney or Riyadh and Copenhagen?
Sydney is quite a big city. I think if you take the greater metropolitan region, you're somewhere between 6 to 7 million. I think New Haven is probably 500,000 or something. In terms of the scale of the cities, it's hard to compare them. But what I did find in New Haven was that it was almost impossible for people living there to exist without owning a car. And this was quite sad because I thought there was lots of people there that didn't have necessarily a lot of money. They might be students who also need to work full time to support themselves, who then somehow need to service a car on top of that because they can't even get to a supermarket, let alone their job or university. It was actually quite hard for me because I had been living in Copenhagen at the time. So, you come with this little bit of a naive, why can't everyone walk and cycle around? And then you go to some of these areas where car dependency is a real issue. It's not a choice. It's not a political statement. It's just people really trying to get by their every days and seeing the impact that their car breaks down and how that can really hurt them financially and socially because they somehow aren't able to access just their everyday needs. To give you a quite clear, Copenhagen is obviously up there, and I would say the other three are equally car dependent in some way, just in different ways.
Do you get to travel much to, say, Paris and Amsterdam these days? Because Paris has been in a huge transformation, and Amsterdam as well. When you look at Paris now, which I presume you go to sometimes, and other places in Europe, what do you see is the difference, and how do you experience the place differently because of the urban infrastructure?
A lot of people look to Copenhagen because historically there has been this really advanced cycling culture. So a lot of people try and figure out how they've done it. I actually think that Paris is one of the most exciting examples of cities in terms of mobility now. And I am fortunate to go there once every 2 years. I really love the city. It's very beautiful. The thing I've noticed the most about Paris, there has obviously been a huge uptake in cycling. It's not necessarily the type of cycling that we're accustomed to. They have this shared bicycle system in Paris, like a series of bus stations scattered all over the city. I guess you would best describe it, but instead of buses, it's places to park a bike. And these can both be normal pedal bikes, and they also have electric bikes there. And what I think this has done is it's created this new layer of transport in the city that's not necessarily about me having my own bike that I need to walk around the city, constantly carrying it, constantly parking it, but just this flexible way that I might need to go from one part of the city to the other, and I pick up that bike, go there. Maybe that other part is close to a metro station, so I jump on a metro and go somewhere else. That might be near a bus stop. Where Paris is really succeeding in cycling, I actually think they've succeeded in making this multimodal transportation system. It's not necessarily just bikes, just cars, just public transport. They've somehow managed to weave all the different modes together. Where I think it's been sold to the citizens is because they've been able to encourage more people to take the bike, less people to drive, therefore reduce the amount of cars in the city, they've actually been able to take some of that space back that would have once been dedicated for cars, parking spaces, traffic lanes, and being able to use some of that space to actually redesign the public spaces within the city. We're talking a lot of ground floor retail, new urban parks, new playgrounds for kids. And when you actually go to the city now, you experience it much more at street level. You see much more people out on the street. You see all these people moving about. I think the job that the mayor Anne Hidalgo has done is just extremely impressive. And I think a lot more people should be looking to Paris, even though I like people looking at Copenhagen as well.
I used to live in Paris a long time ago. I worked for a company I'd never heard of before called Microsoft, so that tells you how many decades ago it was. Back in those days, you had the metro. The metro is the sort of small stops on a subway. Then you've got the RER, which is like an express subway. Then you've got the suburban lines. Then you've got the main lines, and then you've got the TGV. You've also got trams. You've also got buses. This is a huge amount of public transport on top of this bicycle and mobility scooter and footpath infrastructure. I wonder, does Copenhagen have that level of public transport infrastructure?
It certainly does. Copenhagen, I think, opened their first metro line, let's say 2005. I think it's built two more lines since then. So certainly within the inner city, public transportation is extremely good. The funny thing about the metro system is it's actually automated. So there's no actual drivers on any of the metro carriages, which means that they can run extremely efficient and can run basically all night. I essentially don't look at a timetable when catching public transportation in Copenhagen. And that's a huge luxury, I understand. And I think that's one of the things that, if we're talking public transport, we almost need to get to in terms of people trusting it to not necessarily rely on a private car, but actually use public transport, is that feeling that you can almost turn up and you're not going to be waiting longer than 15 minutes. This is this funny thing in Copenhagen. I would say because you have buses, ferries, the train network, the metro, and of course all the bicycles, I don't think anyone looks at themselves as a cyclist. No one really, I think in that same way, has to make that stance about themselves and identify as a cyclist. A lot of people just use it because it's available and they just get around. And also that means that they're not necessarily tied to the bike for all their trips. If it's much easier to take the metro, or if it's raining or cold, or if they need to go a little bit further out and they don't want to cycle 10 kilometers, they just merely jump on something else. The transportation system is actually quite free and flexible, and that's what makes it so robust, that people aren't tied to any one mode. They can pretty much freely do whatever they want.
So you're an architect and you work with the city, I guess, and the state and private companies. So when you're talking about mobility in whichever job it is that you've got, what's your understanding about how the state funds that? Is it Copenhagen City? Is it the state government? Denmark has states of some kind. You have Jutland and various places. So is the state where Copenhagen is that the funding body? How does it work? Denmark's quite small and the general population is quite small. How do they do the funding for those transports?
So to give you some context, I think the total population of Denmark is 5 million. Let's say it's smaller than Sydney. It's pretty small geography as well. We don't have states. We have 5 regions, and then I think it's 92 municipalities, so councils. Yeah, funding somehow happens in this very complicated relationship between all of them. Infrastructure is certainly financed through the national government, through the transport ministry, but I would say that actually a lot of things like bike lanes are actually more financed through municipalities. So actually just using local taxpayer money. Public transport is also financed through municipalities, but then organized by the regions, which would be the state. There's this complex relationship, let's say, between the way that mobility is financed and the different organizations that do it. Copenhagen, in terms of building real public transportation infrastructure, so the metro, has been using quite an interesting model to finance it, but it also is a little bit problematic. What the city did was they set up a public property development company called the City and Harbour. And essentially what that did is the municipality would sell public land that then would be used to build new apartments, build commercial, but basically use the profits from that to finance public transportation. The problem has somewhat become is that we started spending the money before we actually sold all the property. And now we're in this point where we actually have to develop more land to actually pay back huge amounts of debt, to pay for the metro line, for example. And property goes through troughs and peaks. And so maybe there isn't so much demand for housing at the moment, and yet the city feels they have to develop a lot. The cool thing about it, though, is that using a public developer is that all of the new property development is somehow linked to public transport. So they're basically building a new metro line, they own all the land around it, and they're able to build new neighborhoods around public transport. It's quite an interesting model, but also a little bit of a problematic one.
And how do you see the outer suburbs? Because we're in the outer suburbs, you grew up on the outer suburbs. You see that there's a lot of focus going into town, but not so much going across. What is Copenhagen like on the outskirts?
Copenhagen on the outskirts is like many other places around the world. To give you some context, right? Most of the people, when they come to Copenhagen, they look at the inner city. That's a general thing as a tourist. And what they immediately recognize is a lot of people cycling. When we talk about the modal split, in terms of transport. So that's the split between people walking, cycling, driving, and taking public transport. It's about 30% walking, 30% cycling, a little bit under 30% using the car, and then the rest is filled up by public transport. As you go into the suburbs, it radically starts to shift between what you might experience anywhere else in the world. Although there are bicycle lanes and people are cycling, it's a lot of cars out there. The further you go out, it's a lot of big box stores, people driving to get them. And what the result has been is many of the high streets in the smaller towns around the country are actually dying because people are choosing to go out to big box stores. And I think this is a global phenomenon and it's really, really tricky. And I would say this is actually one of the things that we try and work on here. It's how do we actually revitalize the downtowns of places which have predominantly been eroded because people are driving out to these big box stores. But because of the way now the transportation system is set up, it's very hard to attract people back. And especially by walking or cycling, it's disappeared in a way. There's been a lot of effort in terms of how do we encourage different user groups to come down? Is it by incentivizing walking and cycling, by creating pop-up events, markets, and activities that people and families can actually come to, and then having the prerequisite that you're not going to drive there. You're just going to walk because there isn't going to be the space for everyone to park, for instance. It's a tricky thing. I think a lot of the efforts in terms of getting more people to walk, cycle, and take public transport has been essentially focused within cities and especially city centers because of the density. There's some focus on the suburbs, but I think a lot more effort needs to be put in there if we're actually going to be able to get people to adopt other modes apart from driving their car.
Yeah, so let's talk about the mobility diet. I've got an image here in front of me. You've got veg at the bottom, then you've got fruit and bread, and then you've got milk and dairy, and then you've got junk food at the top. So the pyramid that matches that is walking, cycling, boating. I love kayaking. I love that as an image. Generally, anything that is active. Then above that, you've got buses, trains, trams. And then above that, you've got taxis and private vehicles, as long as many people using the car. And then you've got planes and private cars and SUVs. Does that sound correct to you?
The whole idea of the mobility diet is not to be so prescriptive, actually. And that's why there are some of those maybe more joke modes put in, such as kayaks, even though there are people around the world who get to work by kayaking, especially in cities with lots of waterways. But to step back a little bit, the mobility diet has been something that developed out of my PhD work. I was very fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to write a PhD on the intersection between architecture and planning and future mobility. This was back in 2017, where future mobility was autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. Throughout the PhD, it became a little bit evident that some of these technologies were going to take much longer than we first forecasted, but a lot of the goals of these technologies, things like less car accidents on the road, more accessibility for more people, less room taken up in cities because we could reduce the amount of parking, etc. I was like, oh, we have lots of technologies available right now that can do this. We don't necessarily need to wait for these far out technologies like autonomous vehicles come to achieve them. The only problem is doing the PhD and talking about it, I found that the way we discuss mobility is incredibly divided and black and white. It seems to be that we can't have an adult discussion about encouraging people to cycle, for instance, without it being an attack on cars. It seems we get divided into these groups of walking, cycling, public transport, and cars. And I would say all sides are a little bit guilty of it. We tend to find our tribe and then stick quite strongly to it. But what I kind of found, and I think I was describing this more when we spoke about Copenhagen and Paris, mobility is so varied. Even if you're the most avid cyclist or petrolhead, you will still walk occasionally. Your mobility mix is made up of so many different things, being unconscious about it, that mobility is always going to be a combination of different things. And what I was looking for was a tool to actually let people discuss this in a way that maybe took it out of those tribes to try and understand what is this right mix. And what we have done within food was quite inspiring. I think that even though food period is a bit outdated now, I think it was first started in 1972, the general idea most people could get behind. People could understand that I shouldn't only drink soda, or maybe I should have some vegetables with my steak. We could generally get behind the idea that moderation was key, and it was about trying to figure out what was that right mix. And I thought this was a pretty nice analogy for transport, because I think everyone can understand that if we do walk, that is good for us. It's also good for our cities. And just to add an economical thing, if we start to mix the modes, we can actually get some financial benefits to it as well. And I think posting that simple graphic of merely taking the food pyramid and putting some modes on it, it somehow resonated with people. It was posted online to different social media platforms, and it really took off. It was actually just something I made in a workshop because I just wanted to get some participants to be able to talk about, okay, what is the right mix of different modes with any city? And then I thought it was a fun graphic, so I posted it online, and it achieved exactly what I wanted to. It had people discussing what is the right mix of mobility. In the Nordic countries, they really like the idea of it. In Germany, it's been quite popular as well. I think in the US, when I actually appeared on Active Towns, there was some negative criticism saying Americans don't like diets, which I found quite funny. But generally, it's a framework that people being able to use, especially when talking with citizen engagement, about what is the right mobility mix, because it's not prescriptive, it's a discussion tool.
It is true that I tend to be one of those ones who goes, well, I can't actually think of anything good about a car. Yep, they're useful sometimes. And I think this is one of those discussions that we had. I was thinking sometimes they're really useful. Sometimes they're just what's needed. The question is, well, we shouldn't be having cookies and cream every day. We shouldn't be having burgers and chips every day, but that does seem to be what we've got, and it seems to be all we're given. And before coming on air, I was thinking about my mother, who was born before the war, so in the early post-war era in England. She said it was very, very hard to be obese in those days. But today, it's actually quite hard to not be obese because of the way our place is designed, and because also there are a lot of vested interests. That's one of the challenges about mobility, is the vested interests, the high levels of promotions. I found out recently that Australians see about 1,000 ads a day for cars, and most of them are SUVs or pickup trucks. My understanding about what you're describing then is that it's not a prescription for you shouldn't be eating junk food, because that invokes a lot of guilt, but instead to be able to say, well, how do we want to design our spaces? What transport modes do you want? Do you do it with practitioners? Do you do it with general community? Do you do it with city, municipality officials?
Just before I jump into that, I just want to go back a little bit to your mum and her diet, because this is also one of the nice metaphors that comes out of the mobility diet as well, that diets change. Basically, if you look at this food pyramid from 50 years ago, it looked completely different to the one we have now. I would say that diets typically comprised of meat and 3 veg, and that was suitable. But I think over time, as we've seen that our food systems actually have impact on the amount of space that we use for farming now, the health impact of us, it's actually changed over time. The recommendations that were 50 years ago, they aren't the same as we have today, and they might not be the same as they are in the future. And I think this is what is nice about the mobility diet, because actually what we found throughout the 20th century is that cars were great. Cars were essentially like the internet. In the same way that we are being connected through the internet, the fact that we can talk on other sides of the world, this is what cars did for society back then. The only problem is that we decided to redesign our cities around them. Any kind of idea of independence that cars gave quickly became dependence. So all of a sudden, you couldn't actually be part of society unless you had a car. It's the same as having a smartphone. It's almost as if you can't exist in society without it. And so basically, when we talk about the mobility diet, even though it worked 50 years ago, we need to recognize that our diets need to change. And the thing is in the same way that I would say Australian diets are also extremely different to what they were 50 years ago. You know, we have the most amazing ability to try food from around the world. We have that with mobility now. It's not just car versus bike versus bus. There's actually like a whole range of different gadgets that you can either buy, you can rent, you can just jump on for one access. And this is where I think this mobility diet framework comes as a tool, because you can actually have this discussion. You can actually talk about all these different things and then understand how it will actually play out in the city. To go back to your original question, I found the tool works in lots of different situations. It works talking to politicians and key decision makers. It works with involving citizens. I've seen examples where municipalities here in Denmark have simply printed it out in a big A0 poster. They put it in the middle of the square, and then they have a questionnaire and going to people on the street and asking them. Why I think it works across the different user groups is that it's quite an open question. It's not trying to say that any one thing is bad. It's more just trying to have an honest discussion about what is the moderation and right mix between different modes. And I generally think that people are pretty understanding of it. I think most people, when you just are able to have this framework and discussion, people say, oh, yeah, I could probably walk that one trip. Maybe you have shops 500 meters away. Yeah, I could probably do that. Maybe I will. What I would see would be the first step, just having that someone is going to make this little bit of change in their life. Because if we're going to go back to this diet analogy, it's the worst thing people can do is go on a crash diet. We can't honestly expect people to just give up their car and then just start to cycle everywhere. That might work for a week, if that, and then we could completely fall apart. Whereas in the same way that our diet works, if you make small incremental steps that we know are very easy to achieve, this is where you can actually see a real difference over a long time. And I don't know why this analogy to the diet works with mobility so well, but somehow I just see all these different overlaps with it coming through.
If somebody's at council, a transport department, inside the team, and they think this would be a really cool discussion, how would somebody go about that? Give me some ideas.
Well, if they were to use the mobility diet framework, it's been published as an open source tool available online, and it's very easy to download the materials and use. It doesn't have to start being so formal. It's not like you have to set aside 2 hours and do it. I really like the idea of using the internet, using videos, whether that's long form or short form, as ways of just being able to forward things to colleagues. It's a no impact or a very low risk way to start a discussion about things. I think often the mobility diet just starts discussions because it does have things like a surfboard, like a windsurfer in it, or as you say, a kayak. And so at the very least, people are going to say, I can't windsurf to work when it opens up in that way. I've been listening to a few of your podcasts. The question that you often ask about junior transportation is a really tricky question that you ask people, because generally people low down in organizations don't have a lot of agency. So it's actually really hard for them to act change internally. But what I would say is the young people that have a voice that I see are typically using social media. They're able to find lots of very relevant information. There are lots of available tools to present that in different ways. And then they're finding a voice through the internet. And I think this is very much related to the work that you're doing. I can see that you've somehow found a voice on the internet, and there's many different practitioners who are now wanting to come and talk to you, wanting to come and contribute. And I think it's a very good model for how to enact change. It's somehow moving the conversation to another place. So although you want to have it within your organization or local council, maybe you don't have the agency to do it, but you can find a much greater voice outside of it, which could eventually come back because of the way that social networks work. That would be my way to go about it if I was starting out again.
What I know is that some people in council don't want anything that's not a car. Other people in council want a really good mobility diet that you've got here. And I think there is a lot more variability. We can think council is like this, state is like that, the federal is like that. But it's people just doing stuff. People are people, and then sometimes they work in council. I like your idea about people have internal software where they just share ideas and they chat and they connect in that way. And I think, as you say, just to start the conversation, what do you think about kayaking to work is a great place to start. I was also thinking about in the community, that's a really good tool, the mobility diet, because I think about my friend who has a couple of small kids. She doesn't necessarily want to talk about mobility. She thinks it's a big problem, but she doesn't know how to go about it. A tool like that would be really useful for her to get together with some of the other mums and go, how do we make it better for the kids to be able to ride to school? And this could be a nice way to start that conversation. What do you think about that as an idea?
100%. I think this is exactly the type of situation that it should be used for. I think somehow a lot of talk about mobility becomes academic very, very quickly. The majority of people don't actually think about it. They just think, I just want to get from A to B, or I want to do it in a nice way. They're not necessarily thinking of the negative externalities. So all the consequences about my choices, which is maybe the way we frame it, those working in the field. And I think just an actual talk of just understanding, okay, here is my range of options. What would I like to do? Which ones are good for me? Which ones are bad for me? Which ones are good for my community, which ones are bad for my community, and just having an overall talk about that. And I think a group of mothers or a connection to a school would be a really great way to do it, because I think often a lot of, let's say, culture is built up through schools. So if you want to enact change, it's often by teaching kids, and certainly then programs could come out of it. I think some really nice community events that happen around schools are things called bike buses. Same concept as a bus, where you have a designated route and stops, but it's just a couple of parents picking up kids on bikes along the way. I would think that's a very nice representation of the mobility diet and something that could come out of it, especially because it's allowed for that first discussion to take place in a non-judgmental way.
What I really appreciate about what you have put on the table is just that it's a great beginning point of conversation. So just as we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to add? Any final thoughts, any concluding remarks, anything I forgot to ask that I should have asked?
The one thing I always like to remind people is that when people look at Copenhagen or places like Paris, they see the successes of it in a moment, but what they might not realize is that things always haven't been that way, and it's actually a lot of work to keep it that way. A lot of investment happens in Copenhagen. It's a continual work. It doesn't necessarily happen so easy, and so when people are considering it in their own communities, just understand that work has also taken place in places like Copenhagen, and now they've seen the results, and now they're continually working for it. And I think it's always important because there were cars all over the place in Copenhagen. It wasn't this bike-friendly city just 50 years ago. It's through the voice of the people actually wanting it and building it that it's actually been able to occur. So I think it's always important to remember this.
Paris, I mean, when I was living there, it was decades ago, it was just cars everywhere and the periphery, people going really fast across the periphery. And I've seen they've just reduced the speeds and that's had a lot of really positive outcomes. But yeah, it's not one person who did it. What do they say? It takes 10 years to become an overnight success. Well, it's been fantastic chatting with you. I have learned so much. I didn't quite understand about the mobility diet and what tool it was, so I'm really pleased to have had this conversation. It was fantastic also going to all the different places. It's nice to meet somebody who's traveled around a lot. I really enjoyed it. What I like about it is that I feel I have a tool that I can talk with others about. This is going to be a great resource. I'll share it with others in my communities.
Okay, I'm so happy to hear that because I think this is why I first reached out. You had posted online that you were looking for tools in order to speak. Maybe it was to elderly people. There was a certain group that you wanted, and I thought, okay, this is maybe what the mobility diet could be for. I would just also say thank you for having me on your show. I think the work you're doing is amazing. I really hope that all the effort that you're putting in turns into actual success in your community.
Well, it takes 10 years to become an overnight success. We're 1 year in, basically. So you never know, 9 years and we'll be amazing and we'll see Moreton Bay as a completely transformed place. I figure if we can do it here in Caboolture, you can do it anywhere. That's my motto. So thank you very much for coming on the show and sharing all your great insights. I've really appreciated it.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out getaroundcaboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.